Wow, this is quite a group.
Wow. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see such an energetic and large crowd this morning for our conversation with Raj Shah. I'm Nancy Birdsall, the president of the Center for Global Development, and it's an honor. It's a privilege, and I'm looking forward very much to the content of this conversation. Raj Shah, of course, you all know, is just back from a trip to Africa, spent time with the president. It was fun to see him on the video wandering in the market in Senegal and chatting with President Obama. Let me say a word quickly about Raj, and then we'll go straight to the matter at hand. I think all of you know, you have his bio. Everyone knows who he is. You're here because he's the very distinguished and accomplished administrator of USAID. He was an undersecretary and chief scientist at the Agriculture Department. And I wanted to mention, looking at his bio, which I know already, that he launched at the Department of Agriculture the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and he's taking the same kinds of steps at USAID. He was, of course, at the Gates Foundation for 7 years, where he was the Director of Agricultural Development. And in the earliest days, that's how we met. Raj was working on global health issues. And at the Center for Global Development, we were fortunate to meet him early and benefit from some of his own thinking about innovations in the health area. You also probably know that he's a doctor. He has an MD from the University of Pennsylvania. And then I saw he has very distinguished masters in public health from Wharton School, LSE, Michigan, etc. Now, more important, I wanted to say that all this, and still, and this is not a joke, this guy is still a young man of promise. We look forward to the future with Raj. So Raj is just back from Africa. Maybe we could start, Raj, by your saying about the trip. What's your impressions? What made you happy? What made you excited? Maybe if you had any disappointments, let us know.
Well, thank you, Nancy, and thank you for the whole CGD family and community for coming together for this discussion. It's really exciting to be here. I see Peter McPherson, my esteemed predecessor here. That's always great, and it's just an honor to be with you. We do have a few folks from our team here, so I'll just take a moment to introduce Chuck Cooper. Chuck, why don't you stand up and say hi to folks, who runs our Legislative and Public Affairs group. Mimi Alamayu, who you all know is the Deputy Director of OPIC. Looking around, Michelle Sumalis, our Deputy Chief of Staff. And I thought I saw Andy Herskowitz, who is running Power Africa, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk about, and came back from Ecuador to take on that responsibility. So thank you, Andy. It's really exciting to be here with you. The opportunity for the President to visit Africa was really a very exciting one that we had been looking forward to for many, many months, and the President himself had been so deeply committed to. As you saw, he had a chance to travel to Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania, and really throughout the visit carry forward a message that was really quite simple and quite straightforward, that we, as America, seek a new, broader, expanded partnership with Africa, a partnership that's grounded in the fact that 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa, a partnership that's grounded in the opportunity for improved trade and investment and growth for all parts of the partnership, and a partnership that carries forward and modernizes our tradition of working on development and health issues in a way that can achieve very concrete and specific results. And the President really said it best over and over and over again, that we have a new model of pursuing development activities and partnerships, and it's a model that's grounded in some of our collective learnings over the last several decades, and a model that CGD has played a huge role in shaping and putting forward. But we demand and expect mutual accountability. That means we'll do things in a more transparent way, in a more open way, looking to work more directly with local partners. But we'll also expect countries to make tough policy reforms and genuinely be committed to the goals of opening up certain sectors like agriculture or energy to real private investment so that this can be a public-private effort going forward. It's a model that's grounded in some degree of public investment, but also fundamentally bringing all of the tools of government together to enable public and private partnerships to flourish and thrive. And it's a model that ultimately seeks to deliver results that include building the capacity and the conditions so that aid and long-term assistance is not needed in perpetuity. And so we found a very strong positive reception for that message in all of the places we visited with heads of state, government leaders, business leaders and CEOs, civil society champions, and the president really did have an opportunity to meet with all of those communities and groups in each of the places where we had a chance to stop and pause.
So in the press, I guess I would say the message came through very strongly on this issue of partnership, on economic development and on growth. Also, the idea of promoting democracy, that the countries the president visited had reasonably good situations in terms of their government, having honest, responsible government. Do you want to say anything about, was there much discussion of that issue in those countries? And do you want to say anything about the choice of the three countries?
Sure. Well,
around which there was also some discussion and some controversy.
Absolutely. I mean, the reason we started the trip in Senegal is they have successfully pursued a peaceful, democratic transition of power, and that was a statement about our values and our commitment to democracy. The president, as you'll recall, on 2 separate occasions has invited groups of elected leaders from Africa to come to the White House and visit with him and be hosted by our team. And in both of those settings, those groups focused on democratically elected leaders that were trying to bring democracy and open government to their countries and their regions. So that was a pillar of this trip. And throughout the visits, the president was very clear and very articulate and very specific about the need to both really respect and cherish democratic principles and practices and run government in an open manner so that citizens can see where resources are going, citizens can understand what services are being provided, and there are public and transparent avenues of recourse in the context of those democracies, and that's a conversation we had everywhere. The other thing I'll say is the president in Senegal, actually on Gorée Island, the visit got a lot of attention, of course, because the president had a chance to visit some very important symbolic sites there. But he also had the chance to privately sit down with about 12 or 15 citizen activists who had been a big part of the civil society movement to bring about a democratic transition of power. And there was one banner organization called Yenamar, which roughly translates into "We are fed up." And it was a group of young people that had come together to say, we demand a proper democratic process and transition of power. And I will say, we, USAID, other agencies support these civil society organizations. They reach thousands and thousands and thousands of community groups, of young people, of schools, of other communities with the message to get people out to the polls and to get people engaged in the practice of democracy. And that was really very inspiring, I think, for the president and for the civil society leaders that came together for that discussion.
And, did you personally have a role in the discussion of the choice of the countries?
Well, we all did, and I think at the end of the day, a lot goes into defining how such a constrained amount of time can be used. As the president has said it himself, we wanted to go to all 3 regions of sub-Saharan Africa. Wanted to have the opportunity to highlight a priority on democratic governance and open and transparent governance and efforts to fight corruption. And we wanted, of course, to be able to interact with CEOs and civil society leaders. And so that really defined the choice of countries. He also spoke, I think, very directly about why he didn't visit Kenya, for example, in an open town hall that was projected throughout the continent. saying that at that point, at this point in time, while there's a ICC process ongoing, that getting involved in that probably was not the right moment for such a visit.
Mm-hmm. So Raji, thank you for your nice, kind remarks about CGD already. You know that we've been saying for some years that development is about more than aid, and that we'd like to see the USAID Administrator as engaged as possible in the whole set of development issues when decisions are made, particularly at the White House level, but at other levels. So let me ask a little bit in that spirit about the trade and how much discussion there was on the trade issue, with the background being reminding everyone that at the moment there's a lot of discussion about negotiating a trade agreement with Europe and with the Asia-Pacific region. And we have AGOA coming up very soon for renewal. We would like to see the renewal period far longer than 5 years. That would lock in perhaps more investor confidence than there is now. Could you say anything about that? Was there discussion? Will this administration put some energy into the trade issue with Africa and with the least developed countries too? The MDG that hasn't been finished of duty-free, quota-free access for the least developed countries, many of which are in Africa.
Yeah, well, the short answer, Nancy, is absolutely. And the president was crystal clear that AGOA will be a major second-term priority. He was also very clear that as we pursue a renewal of AGOA, we want to do it in a way that connects our development investment to the opportunities that creates. And we launched, for example, in the East African community, a program called Trade Africa, which we will expand to other regions within Africa, recognizing that intra-African trade still hardly accounts for 10% of the region's total trade. In other parts of the world, it's 40% or 60% in Western Europe, for example. And we think there's a lot of opportunity for that kind of intra-regional trade. In addition to that, the president was also very clear that as we pursue an AGOA renewal, there are issues that will have to be worked through so that companies on both sides have a level playing field and can engage in an effective way. And there are a few issues related to that in South Africa, for example, that we're going to need to work through. Mike Froman was on the trip as the newly minted ambassador as the U.S. Trade Representative. And we're going to be deeply committed as a team to making that happen.
That's a good signal in itself, come to think of it.
Absolutely.
Mike Froman went with the president to Africa, right?
Yeah.
It's maybe his first.
It was definitely his first trip.
I
think
right.
It was. Yeah, I think it was confirmed just a few days before. So.
Great. And let me ask the same set of questions. Well, it's one question about climate. The president made an important speech on the approach that the administration will be taking, which was foreseen, but it was important that he made the speech. Not much about the development aspect in the speech. That's okay, but the question really is, in the background, has there been discussion? What has been your role in that discussion that led up to the speech? How do you see it sort of evolving? Will there be... There was the climate was one of the 3 initiatives that the president announced at the General Assembly speech in his first term, but we've seen more about Feed the Future and the Global Health Initiative. Where are we on the climate and development question?
Well, it's a great question. Everywhere we went, this was very clear. We did a lot of work. That photograph is a visit focused on agriculture in Senegal. And there's no question that a hotter, drier climate is putting significant pressure on especially rain-fed agricultural systems throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And so I applaud the center for working, I think, more on climate-smart agriculture and thinking about that intersection. That'll be even more important going forward. The same is true in energy. Across the board, the energy projects that make up Power Africa are largely clean energy projects, hydropower programs, things that we think can be an effective path forward and an effective alternative to higher emissions coal-based energy. So as you know, in the president's speech, he made some commitments about how we will really focus our international support in energy towards clean energy sources and sustainable energy sources, and not support on large scale kind of coal power going forward. But in general, I think the Africa trip was very clear in that it showed both the absolute urgency of working on climate issues as it relates to these development and growth objectives, and on how that can be working on those areas can be a win-win, where we bring technology and private investment together to tackle these challenges and create a different growth path that is cleaner and greener and more sustainable and ultimately more economically rewarding, creating more jobs on both sides of the ocean. And the president spoke a lot about that on this visit.
So have I been missing pictures? Did you want to show more?
Oh, well, we brought a few. We brought a few in case you wanted to see a few.
Yeah, why don't you? You want to?
We
or was the idea that they'd just be?
Yeah, no, we can flip
along?
through it. Well, let me go, if you go back to that first one, we did an event to release the Feed the Future annual report in Senegal, which was a global release. It showed that through Feed the Future, we're now reaching 7 million farm households and improving agricultural production on 4 million hectares of land in 19 countries, 12 of which are in Africa, and that accounts for about 3.3 million of those farm households are in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is a woman, Nimna, who was explaining to the president that her participation in Feed the Future has allowed her to both grow her income and build a cooperative organization of a couple thousand farmers and sell a high-quality product to large-scale buyers and mills and companies in the area. And so the president was asking her about her income differential, she's bought a tractor, and how that's having that kind of impact. The next slide.
Wait, before you go, you said a lot of numbers. It's very impressive. Tell us, is it in the stage of not yet scale? I mean, is this big, small? Is it meant to be catalytic?
Yeah.
With 3.3 million farmers, how do you think about the future? What's the vision?
Sure.
Is it to show what could be done, but Feed the Future isn't going to do it all?
That's right. I think the vision is in these 19 countries, 12 of which are in sub-Saharan Africa, we should see a dramatic reduction in hunger, extreme rural poverty, and child stunting within a few years. We're about 2.5 years into real implementation of the program, and the level of scale has been fairly significant. If you look at in those countries, we've gone from 1.8 million farm households to 7 million farm households. The quality of the benefits they're receiving in terms of improved access to seed technology, new fertilizer technologies that are more environmentally friendly, but also more productive and more cost efficient from the perspective of producers, and their access to markets, often enabled by mobile phone-based technology and other modern marketing tools and systems, are all leading to a transformation. But the goal is in these 19 countries, each one we've identified what we call a zone of influence, which is essentially the kind of large-scale breadbasket of the country. In each of those areas, we're conducting household surveys that I think will, over time, serve as a DHS, demographic and health-like survey system for agriculture for the world. And in each of those settings, we're conducting dozens of, I think, 40 total impact evaluations of programs at large scale. So all that data will come in the next few years, but what I think you'll see is for those countries in those areas, you'll see a transformation of the picture of rural poverty, hunger, and child malnutrition. And I think that will be an important marker for the world in terms of what can be achieved
Peter
on a larger
McPherson
scale.
must be, this has to be music to his ears, but we'll ask him later, right? Very good. Okay, sorry, let's go to.
So that was exciting. The president spent a lot of time talking about that program, also visiting with the White House press corps and encouraging them to write about it and get engaged. So that was great. This is just a photo of some of the other sites the president was able to sort of visit and talk to, both entrepreneurs and scientists, people who, in conjunction with them, a lot of them were American land-grant universities represented in partnerships, creating biofortified crops or other improved fertilizer planting techniques. And so we got to see, touch, feel, and most importantly, hear from the beneficiaries of this program. And at the end of this event, the president actually delivered a very powerful defense and case for why foreign assistance at the end of the day is less than 1% of our federal budget and enables these kinds of partnerships that really do transform lives for millions of people. And now we have data and science to prove it. So I thought that was a very important moment. The next photo is the First Lady, of course, with the First Lady, Mariam Sall of Senegal, visiting a school and highlighting some of the work that we do in education around the continent and around the world, and really with a focus on adolescent youth and girls and keeping girls in school all the way through completion of secondary school, which we know and we've seen is so highly correlated with both individual outcomes and in terms of how countries and societies do overall. Mm-hmm. The next photograph is the president launching a program we called the Young African Leaders Initiative. This is an initiative the president has launched in the past, so it's been an effort to connect to and support young entrepreneurs throughout sub-Saharan Africa. What we launched that was new here is a Washington Fellowship component that will identify 500 promising young African leaders every year, bring them to Washington as part of a Washington Fellows program, offer them 2 to 3 months of leadership training opportunities at universities and with partner companies here in the United States. And then importantly, when they go back to their home countries, we being the U.S. government, but USAID in particular, will provide a unique level of support. So if they are starting businesses, we might provide seed grants. If they're seeking mentoring partnerships, we'd facilitate those kinds of relationships.
Okay,
so.
we need you to move along.
Okay,
I'm told we only have a few more minutes.
The last one is,
the
I'm
tough
sure,
questions haven't come
good,
yet. So.
is the president launching. Everybody loves this photo, so we brought it. It's the president, and I know you'll have a question about it. But in the Power Africa program launch, the United States has committed to helping to develop 9,600 megawatts of new power generation and transmission on the continent. We believe that will reach an additional 20 million households with power and energy. The model for getting it done is by bringing together the various tools across the U.S. federal government, in particular our capacity to make grants and provide technical assistance and engage countries in serious policy reforms, and coupling that with OPIC and Export-Import Bank's ability to provide loan guarantees and financing support for American companies or funds that are part of the effort. As part of this effort, we've worked with now 6 countries, and they have each committed to very specific and concrete policy reforms, in some cases reforming a public state utility, in some cases changing the tariff structure of the energy prices so there's a more sustained market. And we've worked with dozens of companies to secure almost $14 billion of private investment to work alongside the $7 billion of public investment that will help generate the outcome of doubling energy access. I will say the socket ball that the president's playing with here was a bit whimsical. It was designed by, I think, 2 Harvard students, and if you play with the soccer ball for a little while, 20, 30 minutes, you can then plug a cell phone into it and charge that for a while. And it was a lot of fun, and it was a reminder to me, because I'm someone, as my team will attest, that is always kind of pushing to look for where's the data and can something scale or this and that. Of the 9,600 megawatts of energy we're committing to, we're not relying on the socket ball for really any of that. But it is a reminder, I think, to all of us that development is serious work that deserves serious attention and rigor, but we also got to make it fun and make sure that the people who don't engage in our work on a day-to-day basis can see and feel the enthusiasm that we all have for making the world a better place by bringing these tools together to create this kind of change.
So Raj must have read the foreign policy piece by my colleagues, Charles Kenny and Justin Sandefur, complaining a little bit about the soccer ball, but in a very positive context of saying, saying that the group that you started really was your innovation in a way at AID, the DIV, which stands for Development Innovation Ventures, has a lot of good ideas. I don't want to give you more chance to say great things about all the good things that are going on. Let me go back to, but it is, we do like DIV. We do think there's a lot of good ideas there, and it's very exciting. And it's good to hear you indirectly saying those other things that they're developing, including on the energy side, are being evaluated systematically, and just the whole emphasis on evidence-based policies is great. But let me ask a little bit more, but particularly with Mimi here, the role of OPIC and USAID working together on power. I mean, it hasn't worked that well in the past. Raj knows that we've done a lot of work, and I personally have been engaged in the U.S. approach to development in Pakistan, where it's been so problematic, including getting some arrangement for OPIC and USAID to work together. So tell us a little bit more about how we can help. There will be problems. You know, these countries will not easily make the policy changes that were on the table and under discussion. How do you see that going forward? It's really, I mean, consider the Inga issue. For those of you who don't know, it's a potential hydroelectric project that would serve many, 50 million people, 80 million people, I don't know, and it doesn't involve any resettlement or anything. It's all downhill, basically. But it's going through a lot of difficult countries. Give us a little feel for how you see the challenge and how we can help push along as time goes.
Well, first let me say that it's very clear that with 2/3 of sub-Saharan Africans not having consistent access to energy, with that being the #1 complaint from small and medium enterprise and really all business leaders, that the high and erratic cost of energy limits their capacity to manufacture goods, to build businesses, to add value to resources that are in the continent and underground. And with the fact that almost 85% of the rural population not having consistent access to energy, that this is the core constraint to growth. It's also the core constraint to the kind of partnership that this trip was about. So our decision to focus on the issue is very much driven by an evidence-based learning process where we've identified this as the core constraint after working with and listening to our partners. The tools we have to bring to resolve the constraint are fundamentally about creating a market infrastructure for energy production, generation, and distribution that can welcome in private investment, and then using...
Right. I think tell us why this will work in a way it hasn't worked for the World Bank. The African Development Bank has put a lot of healthy emphasis on, is it that the U.S. is bigger, smarter?
Well,
what's going on
first,
here?
I think we're doing this with the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And I'll just give you an example. Take the Lake Turkana project in Kenya, which was a large energy project that the World Bank stepped away from. The African Development Bank provided the financial backing for. When these tools are brought to bear together, we have seen that we can, in fact, make these projects work. And we have actually listed out about 30 specific transactions. We are placing in countries transactions advisors and different business units within country governments that will be able to accelerate the speed with which these projects get closed and actually happen, right? And on each of these, we're working with OPIC and EXIM and others to say, okay, if we put in some technical support, some resources on the grant side, if we can get the African Development Bank to provide a partial risk guarantee to buy the energy at the end of the day on behalf of a country government, then OPIC and EXIM can come in with the tools they have to encourage and support U.S. firms and investors to be part of the effort. And we've seen that model work, and we're very optimistic it can. You're right, though, that it's only going to work if countries make the decision to do the right things and then see that decision through. So we're not going to be able to double energy access through sheer investment. It's going to happen in partnership with the real reforms that countries pursue. But with the countries we're starting with, we've negotiated those reforms. We're confident that they can see them through, and we will stay very focused using all of our capabilities to make sure that they are seen through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to believe that it does make a difference, not because of extra money from the U.S., but somehow more engagement with the private sector at the right point, or just the U.S. has tremendous convening and kind of policy power if attention is paid.
Look, I think all of that is true. We still need resources, and
right.
things still cost money. And my joke about all the trade, not aid, is that's the right framework. At the end of the day, it usually ends up in some sort of investment program that costs resources. So and the president was very clear. We're going to propose and request resources that will make this program work, because it's important and it's something we can do. But it's highly, highly, highly leveraged, and I think that's the point you're making.
Yeah, I hope some people will have more questions about, the role of the business people on the trip, and particularly in this area of Power Africa. But it's a very exciting initiative. We only have another couple of minutes, so I can turn to those of you out there for your questions and comments. Maybe we need to give you an opportunity to say something about what's the next big problem for you in your vision of reforming USAID. And I'm talking about the nitty-gritty stuff, where there's bureaucratic and political and sometimes congressional issues that create tension. How's it going?
Do you want me?
USA Forward. Let me give an example.
Okay.
Let me give an example. One of my colleagues, a different one, Vij Ramachandran, did this paper on Haiti. And one of the outcomes of the paper, I think, is a general sense that it would be good if the subcontractors, not just the contractors, had to make fully transparent information about where the money is going on what projects, in what settings, and so on. Is that something you can make happen?
Yeah, we saw the report. We're definitely working on that. I will say, and Chuck might know the timeline, but we will have the next set of data available on the dashboard, I think was it the end of September? Is that right? So we will, we've already, across the federal government, we're on track to meet all of our IATI transparency commitments. But USAID will, by the end of September, if I'm right, Chuck, have all of our procurement data, partner data, and other information on that vehicle so people can see it and interact with it. I would point out that you could already go to both our website and an iPhone app and basically pull all that data. It's a little cumbersome, but you just you click on the country, and then you can click on the division of program, and it'll pull up who the partner is, how much money they get, what they receive the resources for. And with the exception of certain sensitive programs, that's mostly in the public domain already on both our website and our iPhone app. So, but it'll be on the dashboard in addition.
So we'll come back to you at the working level with Chuck and others about the subcontractors, which it is important as long as so much is. Then on the food aid, the effort to do the reforms got stalled. Are you still hopeful? Is there anything else we out here can do on that issue?
Well, let me say I'm very hopeful. We ask for your help and support.
Right.
In Senegal, that was a country where in 2010 we stopped monetizing American wheat. And by all accounts, the success they've had in rice production has been driven both by the adoption of new technologies and by the improved market opportunities that were created by America stepping away from that practice. So we are very focused on the proposal the president put forward. I think we're going to get enough progress in this first go-around to make continued gains, and we will continue to, in future years, keep at it, because this is an important part of ending hunger through business, science, and markets. And it's only going to work if we're willing to do some things differently.
Right. This is going to, what is it, at least 30%?
Our initial proposal.
Tell us all.
Our initial proposal was to move 45% of American food aid and assistance into untied, vehicles and to no longer require, as Congress currently does, that we monetize American food in foreign markets, which is both deeply inefficient and crushes local farmer incentives. And frankly, since we receive cash from Congress, it's not a big part at all of American commodity exports anymore.
And you said the initial proposal was 45. It's still 45%.
It's still 45%, correct.
Okay, lastly, on the Global Development Council, we were a little bit disappointed to see that once again that meeting of this independent group, I guess that's what it is, that's what I'd like to think it is, is not going to happen. But let's make it a big question, Raj. If you were to be in your job for 20 years, which might be a great thing for America and the world, where would you like to see the U.S. development effort or system 20 years from now? Where would you like to see USAID? Can it become, as Hillary Clinton said in a speech here at the center some years ago, the premier development agency? Can it become a thought leader? More generally, what's your vision? And what does that have to do, if anything, with the president's decision to have a Global Development Council? What do you want them to do? How can they help?
Well, let me say very briefly. First, I think I am very proud of what the 9,600 members of USAID have done over these last several years. We've hired in about 1,200 people, including 950-some new Foreign Service officers, which is the largest period of growth in the USAID Foreign Service in the last 20 years. We've put in place new policies, programs through an effort we call USAID Forward that we've talked about before, and put forth a very specific report that shows the outcomes that has led to. I stand by and am very, very proud of those efforts. The new model that we've adopted in the new Alliance for Food Security, where we matched $3+ billion of public investment with $3.7 billion of private investment, with what you're seeing in the Power Africa program, I think does represent the future of how development should work, where it's much more public-private from the get-go. It's larger scale partnerships and aspirations. It brings together the tools we have across the federal government and across society writ large to invent new solutions and promulgate those technologies in an evidence-based way, and it delivers those concrete results. And it's not something unique to USAID. I think lots of other institutions take that approach. But if you look across other development institutions and other countries that do development at large scale, I would argue, and I'd be happy to have this discussion, the United States is leading in pulling together and demonstrating that new model can be a powerful new way of working and transforming development.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. You're trying to do with Power Africa what you've already shown can be made to work on the Food Alliance for the Shah vision, and which is very grounded in the comparative advantage, the Obama vision. It's very much what the U.S. can bring. It's true. It's what the U.S. can bring, this entrepreneurial energy, innovation, a lot of private investment, a business culture. So let me go to all of you. We only have a few minutes. If you don't mind, maybe we could just take a number of different all at once. Please introduce yourself and be as brief as you can, because we took too much time with this interaction. Please.
Hi, I'm Reed Dudgeon with the United Nations Foundation. And the U.S. government, through the State Department, the Energy Department, has been deeply engaged with the Sustainable Energy for All initiative of the Secretary General and now the President of the World Bank. I wonder if you could say a word about how Power Africa will work with that.
Great, good question. I can't see the person, but I see a hand back there. Yes.
My name is Femi Akimbi. I'm with Ekababa, an African business taxonomy company. My question is, what is the U.S. new initiative in financing long-term infrastructure projects in Africa, as China have dominated that environment with mass long-term infrastructural money? The U.S., on the other hand, have to deal with OPEC, with a yearly budget. That means they cannot do long-term projects. And lastly, how is the U.S. partnering with our other donors and friends to develop a higher infrastructure as the continent embark in bigger projects, i.e. the Inca Dam that could almost power the whole continent, and the one railroad system that could take railroad from Cape to Cairo. Please, your response.
Very good. Very good question on OPIC. Maybe we'll let Mimi worry about that. And no equity either, all kinds of issues. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Brinkerhoff from George Washington University. And since there's so much emphasis on what is the unique stuff that the U.S. can bring to Africa, I wondered the extent to which you're engaging with African diasporans who are based here in the United States. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Arend Koerner. I'm from the International Monetary Fund, working with some African governments and international institutions. My question is about could you tell us something about the criticisms of U.S. policy that the President has been hearing on his trip and his response to it from heads of states or from civil society, maybe in terms of the inefficiency of U.S. food aid, the quasi-absence of the private sector in Africa compared to Europe, or whether U.S. policies are far behind European policies in terms of both quantity and the quality of the aid, things like that. Thank you.
Yeah, did any African heads of state complain that the U.S. can't do budget support, can't act more like the IMF? Good question. Okay. Are we running out of, how am I okay? Can I take a few more? Yeah, okay. Back here? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Claudia Farris. I'm with George Mason University. My question is, what is the land ownership model the indigenous land ownership model? And secondly, speaking of indigenous institutions, to what extent are Africans having any input into the projects that are being pursued and the problem definition process? And how do you envision long-term African control over the assets that are created?
Peter, do you want to ask anything? Yeah, he does. Good.
Or
good.
answer anything.
Peter McPherson, former board member, former deputy Treasury Secretary, former USAID Administrator. What else, Peter?
Thank you.
Yeah. Former head of Michigan State, the only president that got the right football team.
Well, Raj, I would just say there's so much, as you know, and I've said many times to you about what you're doing that I like. I think this Feed the Future that the President has so aggressively supported. I like the linkage of nutrition with agriculture, and that's really new and reflects your background and interest. As you know, I think this crowd is largely supportive of the food aid reforms. I certainly am. And I think the tide may be returning, and there was so much more focus on it publicly this time. I mean, we've talked about reform like this going back to my time at AID in the 80s in some form or the other. And there's a real shift. So we can't, even if we don't get it this year, we can't give this up. I guess my last comment would be the power initiative, I think, is really important. We've all been in villages where there has been no power at one time, and then you go back another 5-10 years when power has come in as a whole different village. Now, this is not, the thing I would urge you and your colleagues to think about is to go back and pull out some of the experience. For example, we had a real impact in the Philippines. It wasn't just Marcos's big power plant, but in broad, and this was now 30 years ago, and there were some lessons from how that happened. And there were some of those people who are still around. Ray Love, for example, who's an African expert who did the Philippines Power Project.
Okay,
I think
Peter.
it can be done.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, why don't you take some of those? I'm told we have time for another round.
Okay. Well,
no, you don't have to do them all. You can be selective. But do answer the question about the OPIC annual budget.
Good. Well, I'm going to let Mimi answer that in a moment. Let me just say on Power Africa, we believe We have looked very carefully, Peter, at the past experience, and you're right. There's some great models of how to structure these transactions and these deals in a manner that can work. We also agree that we think this is the most responsive to African requests for partnership and engagement. It brings together the public-private model that is being requested. It brings together the broad range of American tools that are being requested, and it tackles the number one constraint to growth and development that's been identified by Africans for Africans. And frankly, it demands African leadership and is only going to work if African governments and private sector partners do some of the right things against the projects. With respect to China, I would just direct everyone's attention to, I thought, a very coherent set of points the President made in the South Africa press conference on how we think about that. And it's basically, he says, look, we want everybody engaged in Africa. We believe that Africa is rising. We see the growth and development opportunities. We know that that will be accelerated by broad participation on a broad range of terms by all countries and all societies in that context. He also said it's important that Africans make up their mind about what business models are best for Africa's development. What are the models that employ Africans in the production of infrastructure and creating institutions and jobs? What are the models that allow for value-added manufacturing in agriculture or other resource extractive industries in Africa for the betterment of African economies and ultimately the creation of a larger African middle class? And what are the business models that bring brand names that offer transparency and a certain ethic and way of doing business that create the underpinning rule of law that will allow for these economies to succeed in a sustainable way? And that's an African choice, but one that we obviously have a strong point of view on. And I direct your comments or your attention to that. A number of folks have raised this Inga Dam effort, and we actually talked about it at great length. We are very interested in looking at how we can support the development of the Inga Dam program. It's not going to be an immediate project or one that gets done quickly, but it is one of those areas where the right diplomatic engagements, real American leadership, long-term American corporate involvement, and frankly a partnership with South Africa, DRC, China, and neighboring countries can actually enable something pretty significant. And so we welcome your ideas and your thoughts on how to make that happen. Let me just speak about these questions of criticisms we heard or didn't hear. First, on food and agriculture, we did not hear critique. In fact, we heard quite the opposite. There's a broad recognition that the President's leadership from 2009 forward has changed the game in terms of African agricultural development. That includes the President's proposals to reform food aid and assistance. And as I pointed out, in places like Senegal, we've already done it, in terms of phasing out monetization and creating more market opportunities locally. So there's been nothing but real support for that book of business. With respect to budget support and the quality of aid, I would say that the request was actually saying we want the kind of aid and assistance that comes with real public-private partnership and American companies that can be our partners in transforming these economies. And in that context, a lot of excitement for Power Africa. And then finally,
they've given up on. Never mind.
On budget? No, I just don't think.
Or it doesn't matter as much anymore.
I disagree. I just disagree. If you look at the numbers, the countries are not saying that a certain amount of budget support is going to make or break our ability to sustain 9 or 10% growth, to have a broadly inclusive population.
It doesn't matter anymore as much.
Yeah, I don't think it's the defining question. I will also point out that we now use what we call PIO grants. Who knows on my team what that stands for? What is it? Sorry. So we basically can now support and do support, like the health sector in Senegal or the education sector in Liberia. We basically provide budget support. And frankly, we do it in a model that uses this fixed amount reimbursement agreement, which is pretty close to what CGD has been proposing as a cash-on-delivery mechanism. And we do it at large scale, a $45 million health FARA with the Liberian government. That's both budget support and paying for outcomes when they're delivered. And so you can look at that. But But that's not what people were talking about. What people were talking about were bringing private investment into these partnerships.
Your vision, they were
like the
talking
new
about.
model. The president's vision.
The president's vision. The president's vision. Your implementation already of the president's vision.
Right.
And on Mimi Alamayo, you want to say a word about your constraint on the...
What the gentleman was talking about is partly our annual budget, which has to be approved by Congress, even though we make money. But in terms of infrastructure support, what you were talking about, OPIC's product lines are actually much more ideal for infrastructure because we can do large amounts, up to 250 million. But our tenure happens to be quite long, 15 to 20 years, which is actually more ideal for infrastructure. So just to give you an example, OPIC now currently has 16 billion in our portfolio, and about 4 billion, almost 4 billion of it is in sub-Saharan Africa. And as Mr. McPherson knows, he was on our board as well as Raj is currently, we are demand-driven. We go where our clients want us to go. The fact that 25% of our current portfolio is in sub-Saharan Africa actually says something about where U.S. companies are looking at currently. It's our largest region currently, and it's our fastest growing. I think the president mentioned it in his speech in Tanzania. OPIC's portfolio has grown 300% the last 4 years.
So you're saying that your annual credit authorization, whatever it's called, is not a constraint?
I mean, obviously, I think in terms of as an agency that does long-term investments, the fact that our admin budget and then
it's your admin budget that's your problem.
Our admin budget is approved every single year, and our authorization is approved every year. And so, of course, companies want to know that you're going to be in existence for a while. And I think a lot of people are traumatized that in 2008, OPIC was not authorized for about 6 months. So we couldn't actually disperse on any loans. So we obviously would never want to kind of be in that kind of position when we're making huge commitments and sort of empower Africa and other transactions. But I think our biggest challenge, to be honest with you, is, we obviously have that sort of tied aid element in terms of our U.S. nexus. We have to work with sort of U.S. investors. And when you look at infrastructure investments in Africa, I mean, you look at sort of, the highway built in Ghana with MCC Compact and others, there's not a lot of American companies who are bidding on these projects. So I think the more American companies get involved, the more we can do. I think it's sort of our biggest constraint. And another one is obviously our size. We are the U.S. government's development finance institution, and we have about 220 people. We have one person outside of Washington, and that person is based in South Africa. We moved him from India because we were seeing huge sort of demand for our services. But when you look at the G20 or G8 DFIs, I mean, we are the size of the Netherlands DFI. We are the United States, and the Netherlands is the size of Connecticut. I mean, with all due respect to the Netherlands. So, I mean, I think we were created 40 years ago. And
it's time to move on.
And our tools have not changed much.
So you need Raj at the National Security Council to be, and my colleague Todd Moss here at the center has ideas that Mimi knows about, but they'll be going public soon on how to deal with making the whole system, including OPIC, particularly important given the president's vision.
Absolutely.
That you are implementing.
Absolutely.
For a public, that the public money can be relatively small. If it's done well, it's catalyzing the real big private money on key issues. Okay, let's have another quick round. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Whitney Debevoise at Arnold & Porter, formerly at the World Bank as USAID. I'd just like to hear a little bit more about the policy side of the Power Initiative, the regional dimension, and also, I mean, when Eastern Europe changed, many countries followed the prescription of unbundling and then privatizing, and privatizing is done on the basis of long-term contracts. And then when they all joined the common market, DG Comp told them that long-term contracts were anti-competitive in a regional context, and they had to cancel them all, and then they all went to international arbitration. So what is the policy advice, the context, and also the regional dimension?
Whitney, he's a lawyer. He knows too much about these things. Okay, so now I'm told we only have time for one more, and I haven't been over there, so I'm going to go over there, and then that has to be it. Oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't clear. Yes, it's a hand in the back. back there.
Hello, my name is Anna Titchler. I'm from the International Youth Foundation, and my question is obviously based around young people. You met with various business leaders and public-private sector, and I know you guys also had a chance to meet with some young people. I'm curious what the takeaways were from that and what the specific next steps you'd like to see in the agency to improve the lives of young people in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, that's an impossible question, too. Almost everything you said provides a kind of an answer to that question. So let's take one more. Right. Our friend here, yes. I don't mean to, it's important, and it is an important initiative. But
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade, the microphone.
There's your mic, Steve.
This administration is doing so many things in so many different locations, whether in USTR or even Defense Department and so on. A few of us have been getting together, and we're getting a little bit annoyed about people talking about the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TTIP. There's the South Atlantic, not the North Atlantic, where we are doing more. So one of the ideas we just would like you to bring to the National Security Council and other places is time we have a transatlantic South partnership, where you take all your stuff together and you help Mr. Obama get a legacy. Two very specific questions in the trade area. One, tell me a little bit what's going on with the trade hubs. We keep hearing about getting more of a commercial interest in it along the way. We love to know what happened. Two, for us who follow Africa and believe in Africa, the most significant statement the president made on his trip was, I recognize and support Africa's effort to form a continental free trade agreement. First time ever mentioned by a president of the United States. Aid is, we know you're working in the East African community, but you also said you were going to work in other areas. Do you have any plans to expand and get up to the higher level, to the more expansive regional communities like the tripartite group, ECOWAS, et cetera? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. On Whitney's question, which is related, is there anything you want to say about the challenge for Africa, which is so many small countries? How can the U.S. help Africa help itself to be more like these United States? The problem that it's so small. I've often said all of sub-Saharan Africa a few years ago was smaller than the economy of Chicago. Now I think it's bigger because it's grown so much. But maybe you could end with these larger issues, Raj, because we do have to bring it to a close.
Sure.
We're late.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be with you, and these are three very good questions to close on. I'll start with the points on trade. The trade hubs, I won't get into much detail here, will serve as the underpinning of these intra-regional trade programs. We launched Trade Africa initially in the East African community, but we will do that in the South and in the West and really focus on ensuring that the percentage of total intra-regional trade goes up significantly. And without getting into the details, I'll just say that we have very quantitative and specific targets for metrics we can measure and report on. And for those that don't use our iPhone app that has our evaluations on them, there's a great evaluation of the trade hubs that shows for every dollar we've spent on the trade hubs, we've enabled $42 of intra-regional trade. And you can download the app on the iPhone store, the App Store, and it brings all those evaluations up to the front pretty quickly. With respect to, and thank you, the trip was very focused on trade, and I'll take back your comments to our team and to Mike and others. With respect to the policy side of the energy equation, we will have some regional deals in the initial cut. Our goal was to identify projects that we can bring to financial close within 18 months to get the ball rolling, and even in the context of that, there are efforts like Rusumo that are multi-country regional programs. These will require a fair amount of diplomatic engagement across those country boundaries, and it will require the presence of serious long-term purchasing contracts that can have the backing of an African Development Bank or some other partner. And we're working on both, so I don't know all the details of contract law like you do, but these long-term purchase contracts are critical to this model succeeding in the energy space. And then finally, let me address Anna's point. I think, the president was so specific about the basic idea that Africa's future will be determined by Africans. And within that context, where he took specific inspiration, and Mimi and others can attest to this, is in the context of young people on that continent. And so while it is a very broad question, it's exactly the right question to ask. And at the end of the day, in all of the programs we do, as Nancy mentioned, we are trying to find ways to enable and empower young African leaders. But this effort the president announced, which you might say, well, it's only 500 people. It is 500 leaders from across sub-Saharan Africa who will every year be part of a fellowship that we hope over time can build the kind of network across themselves, stay true to their ethics and values about good governance and leadership, and when they are in positions of power, can rely on each other to resist some of the temptations that have, taken promising young leaders and turned them into, the more traditional African big man who, ends up holding back democracy and growth on the continent. So it's a long-term play, and it is modest in its initial scale, but not in its potential to be absolutely transformational. I think the president understands the core of your question and agrees with you completely on the potential there. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. And
Thank you.